The morning air of January 21, 1793, carried the smell of iron and wet rope. Paris was silent, except for the rhythmic creak of the guillotine, a sound that would soon become the anthem of its revolution. History books call it swift justice, a moment of civic virtue, but contemporary witnesses described fountains of blood, spurting like ruptured veins, the steam rising from the scaffold, as if the earth itself were exhaling the heat of human life. The guillotine was never the clean machine of equality that schoolrooms depict. It was a device of industrial death, a wooden throat swallowing men whole, its blade a metal tongue slick with red. As the executioner held up Louis XVI's severed head, the crowd's cheer trembled, part relief, part nausea. Liberty had arrived not as an idea, but as a scent, the metallic tang of royal blood in winter air. The revolution promised justice. What it delivered was a new addiction, the public spectacle of killing. While modern France memorializes the event as the dawn of freedom, the truth reeks of smoke and decay. To understand how a civilized nation turned decapitation into virtue, we must first return to the crumbling palace that made such vengeance inevitable. Before the blade ever kissed his neck, Louis XVI was already dying, not from steel but from silence. Versailles had become a mausoleum long before the revolution breached its gates. Beneath ceilings painted with gods, the king drifted like a ghost among chandeliers. He was not the tyrant of revolutionary pamphlets, but an awkward man who spoke softly, who found comfort not in power but in locks, small mechanisms he could control while his kingdom unraveled beyond marble walls. Each evening, he wound clock springs and oiled hinges as famine gnawed at the countryside. Beyond his gilded windows, starving mothers boiled grass to quiet their children's cries. Inside, the scent of wax and perfume could not drown the stench of decay that came from the streets, the slow rot of faith in divine order. France was an organism devouring itself, and Louis was the heart that refused to stop beating. He prayed in rooms where mirrors multiplied his guilt. Every reflection was a question. What happens when a man believes his crown is heaven's burden, but heaven itself has turned its face away? By 1789, the crowd outside Versailles was no longer chanting for bread. It was howling for transformation. But as bread vanished and mobs gathered, the king's crown became a target and his body the Republic's first monument. The guillotine would not simply end a man, it would dissect the idea of monarchy itself, one vertebra at a time. The trial of Louis XVI was never justice, it was choreography. Inside the stone chamber of the National Convention, the air itself felt sharpened, blades of arguments slicing through ritualized hatred. Deputies spoke with the calm precision of surgeons preparing an amputation. The goal was not to prove guilt, but to transform the body of a man into a symbol that could be safely destroyed. Robespierre's words echoed like a liturgy of purification. Blood is the price of virtue. His voice trembled not from fear, but from conviction, as though killing could cleanse an entire century of sin. Guilt was redefined, not as what one had done, but what one represented. The monarch was no longer a human being, he was contagion. Pamphlets depicted Louis with the jaws of a wolf, his hands dripping crimson, the beast that devoured France. Each illustration was a dissection, stripping flesh from myth, turning veins into rope. The guillotine, they said, would cauterize the wound of monarchy, but every drop of blood only fed the fever. Outside the hall, printers worked through the night, their presses exhaling heat and ink that smelled faintly like scorched flesh. Justice had become a machine, one fueled by paper, slogans, and fear. The machinery of destruction was now in motion, its gears greased with ideology. But before the blade could fall, the real torment began, the slow unmaking of a man's mind. The temple prison did not bleed. It dripped. Every sound was a slow incision, the scrape of boots above his cell, the hiss of a candle dying, the steady pulse of water leaking through stone. Louis XVI was not chained by iron, but by silence. Days dissolved into a pale blur of candlelight and damp air thick with mildew. The walls, sweated like flesh. The ceiling seemed to breathe. Each morning, guards entered like ghosts in uniform, their faces carved from apathy. They watched him eat, pray, write, their eyes dissecting every gesture. He could still hear his son's whimpers through the adjoining corridor, thin and exhausted, a sound like fabric tearing. That was the cruelty, to let him hear, not see. To let hope exist just long enough to rot. In his final diary entries, the handwriting faltered, letters thinning as though drained of blood. He wrote of forgiveness, yet even the ink seemed to tremble. To modern psychology, this was the slow anesthesia of despair, the body shutting down before the executioner's hand could touch it. By the time he stepped into the cold January morning, France was not executing a tyrant. It was dissecting its own conscience, one heartbeat at a time. Dawn crept across Paris, like a blade being unsheathed. The streets were lined with breathless thousands, their exhalations rising into the pale fog like ghosts rehearsing what they were about to witness. The Place de la Révolution stank of iron and animal fear. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, muskets trembling in their grip, the frost whitening their boots and eyelashes. In the center, the guillotine waited, not as an instrument of justice, but as a creature of appetite. Its wooden frame gleamed with frozen dew, and beneath it the straw was already dark from earlier rehearsals. Louis XVI arrived in a plain carriage. Inside, witnesses said, he prayed softly, his breath clouding the glass like mist from a dying animal. When the door opened, the crowd inhaled as one. The king stepped out. No crown, no armor. Only the frailty of a man about to be undone by the very people he once ruled. His hands were bound with coarse hemp rope, fibers digging into his wrists until the skin split. Each drop of blood darkened the snow like punctuation marks in a sentence. History would never finish. He tried to speak, "I'd die innocent," but the drums began. They beat not to honor him, but to smother his humanity. The scaffold stairs were slick with frost and something darker. He stumbled once, the crowd murmured. The executioners caught him, their gloved hands steady, practiced. They positioned him beneath the blade, a lamb offered to a new god. The lunette closed around his neck with a sound like teeth clamping shut. For a heartbeat, all motion froze. Then the blade fell, a silver flash, a brief thud, and a geyser of red mist that sprayed over boots and straw alike. Witnesses wrote of steam rising from the stump, of how the head blinked twice, lips twitching as if still trying to speak. The executioner lifted it by the hair, and for an instant, Louis's pale face caught the winter sun. Some screamed, others laughed, yet most simply stared, as though hypnotized by what justice had become. But the death of a king was never meant to end with the fall of his head. The true horror had only begun, the rewriting of what that blood was meant to mean. The guillotine did not sleep that day. It only closed its eyes. As the crowd dispersed, the square remained thick with a copper scent, blood congealing into dark veins across the cobblestones. Workers came with buckets of sand and vinegar to scrub the platform clean. They scraped the wood until splinters bled beneath their nails. Witnesses said the blood foamed when mixed with the lye, as though the earth itself was trying to vomit out what it had just consumed. By dusk, the scaffold looked reborn, pale, polished, and ready for the next offering. France congratulated itself on purification. Pamphlets spoke of progress, of reason triumphant over superstition. Yet every citizen carried the same ghost, the image of that trembling mouth, the faint steam that rose from a headless body. The government forbade mourning, banned prayers, confiscated any relic of the dead king. Even the priests who dared whisper his name were dragged through the same streets now washed with false purity. The monarchy's blood had been scrubbed away, but the stain remained beneath the skin of the city, invisible, permanent, alive. But history does not stay buried. Centuries later, the ghosts of that morning still drift through Europe's palaces, whispering of the day virtue learned to kill. The centuries that followed tried to bury the scream beneath marble and anthem, Yet if one listens in the corridors of Versailles, the silence still drips, slow, metallic, like water passing through rust. The guillotine may rest in museums now, but its shadow cuts through history's throat. It was a machine that promised equality yet produced only the illusion of mercy, an altar that sanctified the ritual of clean killing. Louis XVI's dignity, preserved in the accounts of his final moments, haunts France like a reflection too vivid to erase. He did not curse his captors, he prayed for them. In that quiet surrender, the revolution found its mirror, for the true terror was not his death, but the revelation that anyone could become the next offering. Modern psychology calls it collective moral anesthesia, the point at which horror becomes routine, conscience mechanized. From the reign of terror to the trenches, to the quiet bureaucracies of modern cruelty, the pattern remains unchanged, moral conviction mutating into sanctioned violence. In killing its king, France believed it had slain tyranny, but history whispers otherwise. It merely learned to wield the blade under a new name and call it